Okay, welcome to the channel. This is the Gangs of Montreal Part 3 video to close out this 3-part series. As a quick note before I get started, everything presented in this video is based on publicly available information, and this is intended to be a general overview for people interested in the subject. And as always, I do mean general overview. This is a very complicated topic, and there's a lot of information I didn't include in these videos. But I did my best to put together a reasonable summary of some of the major criminal organizations in Montreal's history. And honestly, I'm glad to be done with this series. It's an interesting topic, and I'm going to cover more Canadian gang videos down the road. But I cover a wide variety of topics on my channel, and I'm really looking forward to a bunch of different videos I have coming up this year, including a bunch of Canadian travel videos that I hope you'll find interesting. As always, thank you very much for watching. I know your time is valuable, and I truly appreciate everyone that has watched my videos and subscribed to my channel. So in the Gangs of Montreal Part 1 video, I focused on the outlaw motorcycle clubs that have been active in that city. And in Part 2, I focused on Montreal's mafia-style organizations. And this Part 3 video is a bit of a mixed bag. I'm going to cover some of the groups and individuals I didn't talk about in Parts 1 and 2. And I'm going to start this off by talking about the infamous Dubois brothers. Initially, I was going to include them in the Part 2 video, but that one was already way too long. The legendary Dubois brothers certainly formed a sort of family mafia of their own in Montreal. And at their peak, they were the only other criminal organization that was a serious rival to the Italian mafia. They were involved in extortion, loan sharking, taxing other criminals, fencing stolen property, prostitution, drug distribution, and murders. So the Dubois brothers were born to Napoleon Dubois and Alice Thibodeau in the St. Henry neighborhood of Montreal. The Dubois family had 10 sons in total. Their son Roger was never involved in crime and later became a government worker. However, their other 9 sons would go on to form a powerful criminal organization in Montreal. These 9 brothers were made up of Adrien, Claude, Jean-Guy, Raymond, Normand, Roland, Jean-Paul, René, and Maurice Dubois. The family grew up in poverty, and the brothers became very close and tight-knit early on in life. They would later explain that when they were growing up, they would be mocked at school for wearing old dirty clothes. They often had nothing to eat but molasses sandwiches, and at other times they had to skip meals entirely. The brothers started their life of crime in the 1950s, committing burglaries and armed robberies around the city, among other things. Claude Dubois was one of the most prominent of the brothers. When Claude was young, he started working as a doorman for the Catroni crime family, and this helped the brothers establish underworld connections early on. For a time, Claude Dubois worked as a nightclub singer in his spare time, and interestingly, there's another much more popular singer from Montreal with the exact same name. By the 1960s, the brothers started extorting local bars and nightclubs. They would terrorize these businesses into paying protection money, and they would then completely take over these establishments and use them to operate other illegal activities. They would start by visiting a particular bar or nightclub and initially acted friendly, but then they would start harassing patrons, staff, and owners of these establishments. This would progress over time until the owner of the business agreed to the brothers' demands. The brothers usually demanded about $100 a week in protection tax. This would be equivalent to about $1,000 a week today. If the owners refused their demands, they were often murdered. A man named Louis Fournier, who was the owner of the Jean-Loup Cabaret, refused the brothers' demands to take over, and he was quickly killed. Eventually, the brothers completely took over some of these bars and clubs, using them as bases of operation for all sorts of criminal activities. The Dubois also started extorting local drug dealers, prostitutes, strippers, loan sharks, and thieves. By the late 1960s, the brothers had built up a powerful criminal organization that was so influential in the city that they were the only group considered to be a serious rival to the Italian mafia. Each of the 9 brothers had associates working directly for them, and the Dubois criminal network had hundreds of men working for the family. The brothers didn't really have a formal structure or hierarchy. They either individually or together controlled different territories and criminal activities in Montreal, and they often shared their soldiers with each other. The gang's top hitman was Donald Lavoie. He was a prominent gangster from Montreal, and he was involved with the brothers for over a decade. Lavoie would later admit to killing at least 15 people for the gang, and ultimately he stated that he was terrified of the brothers. He claimed that they were far too powerful and violent, and he feared that one day Claude Dubois himself would put a bullet through his head. By the 1970s, the Dubois had established the most prominent loan sharking operation in Montreal. Borrowers had to visit one of the brothers' offices or businesses directly to obtain the loan, and they had to pay the cash back at the same location. Of course, the interest was quite high on these loans, usually about 30%. Through extortion and loan sharking, the brothers were becoming very wealthy and powerful. But starting in the 1970s, they realized that the drug trade was the most profitable criminal enterprise. The Catroni Mafia started showing signs of weakness in the 1970s, and this contributed to the Dubois gang quickly establishing a drug distribution system throughout Montreal. Out of the 9 brothers, Adrian, Claude, and Roland were the most heavily involved in the drug business. One of their former dealers later testified that the brothers imported marijuana from Mexico for $30 a pound and sold it for up to $750 a pound on the streets of Montreal. Besides marijuana, they were also heavily involved in trafficking LSD, amphetamines, and cocaine. The brothers' drug dealers worked freely out of the many bars and nightclubs controlled by the family, and their drug business made the Dubois even more wealthy and influential in Montreal's underworld. It's also thought that the brothers consulted and cooperated with Frank Ryan of the West End Gang, who had control and influence over the Port of Montreal. Adrian Dubois was the second youngest of the 10 brothers, and he was very prominent in the family's drug trade. Adrian was considered much more intelligent and cautious than his brothers, who generally enjoyed openly flexing their power, and he was considered to be very instrumental in the success of the brothers' drug empire. Adrian developed drug connections overseas, including a corrupt government official in Pakistan, and he developed a significant source of drugs in that country. It's also thought that Adrian introduced the Montreal Mafia to these foreign connections. The Dubois brothers largely cooperated with other criminal organizations in Montreal, but that wasn't always the case, and they were involved in some significant conflicts. In 1973, a man named Richard Desormier got on the wrong side of the Dubois family. It turns out that Desormier was the brother-in-law of Frank Catroni. The Dubois would meet with Frank Catroni over this conflict, and they basically told him, if you don't bring Desormier into line, we will. Eventually, on July 20th of 1973, Richard Desormier would be killed, and Claude Dubois was one of the people involved in his murder. The brothers also had a significant conflict with the McSween gang. Going back to the late 1950s, one of the Dubois met Pierre McSween in reform school while serving a 2-year sentence for theft. Pierre McSween and his brothers ran an Irish-Canadian gang in Montreal, and they would develop close ties with the Dubois. The McSween gang specialized in hijacking trucks. They would sell their stolen merchandise to the Dubois, and the brothers would supply the McSweens with weapons and getaway vehicles. Over time, the McSween gang developed a drug-dealing operation in territory adjacent to the Dubois, and the two gangs peacefully coexisted for years. Starting in 1973, war between the Dubois and the McSweens broke out, with the Dubois attempting to drive the McSweens from their territory in order to expand their drug distribution operation. The conflict was instigated when Réal Lapine, who was an associate and drug dealer for the McSweens, was murdered in a bar on Notre Dame Street after he refused to sell Adrien Dubois drugs. Over a dozen people were killed in the ensuing conflict, including Pierre McSween's brother Jacques, who was ambushed in his house on October 4th of 1974 by Adrien, Claude, and Jean-Guy Dubois. The most infamous incident in this gang war was the Valentine's Eve massacre. This occurred on February 13th of 1975 at the Hotel La Pinière in the south side of Montreal, which was a popular meeting place for the McSweens. During a country music concert, 3 gunmen entered the bar and opened fire. This attack left 4 people dead and 5 others injured. 3 of the people killed were not involved with either gang. Obviously, this was extremely brazen and highlighted the Dubois gang's level of brutality. After this incident, Pierre McSween was openly critical of the brothers, claiming that they were not competent killers, having sprayed gunfire on a crowd and killing innocent people, instead of just killing their target. It turns out their main target was Roger Letourneau. He was a McSween associate who had previously worked for the Dubois. At the end of this gang conflict, the Dubois gang effectively took over the McSween drug-dealing territory. The brothers were also involved in another major gang conflict of the 1970s. Over time, the Dubois had developed close ties with the Popeye Moto Club. I covered this club in the Gangs of Montreal Part 1 video. The Popeyes were the most prominent of the pre-Hells Angels motorcycle clubs in Montreal, and it was the Montreal Popeyes that patched over to the Hells Angels in 1977, making them the first charter for the Angels in Canada. Starting in the early 1970s, the Popeyes started working as muscle for the Dubois brothers. As the 1970s progressed, there was a growing tension between the Popeyes and the Satan's Choice Motorcycle Club. Satan's Choice started out in Ontario, and at the time they were one of the largest outlaw motorcycle clubs in Canada, and they were looking to expand to Montreal. The Satan's Choice Club allied themselves with the Devil's Disciples. This was another outlaw motorcycle club that started in Montreal. The Devil's Disciples had established a very profitable drug trafficking operation around St. Henry Square, which had essentially become an open-air drug market. Claude Dubois in particular saw the Devil's Disciples as a threat. In 1974, the first Montreal Biker War kicked off. This essentially had the Popeyes versus the Satan's Choice and Devil's Disciples, and the Dubois would provide significant support to their longtime allies, the Popeyes. Between 1974 and 1976, 20 people were killed, and over 30 people were injured in this biker conflict. The Popeye Moto Club was supported by not only the Dubois gang, but also the Hells Angels. They would emerge victorious after this conflict, and for a short time it solidified their position as the Dubois brothers' main assassins and drug dealers in Montreal. By the mid-1970s, the Dubois had established a major criminal empire in Montreal, and at times they openly defied the authorities. There's a famous story from November of 1976. Raymond Dubois, who was the oldest brother, was recklessly driving his limousine through the streets of Montreal, and after driving through 12 red lights in a row, he was pulled over by police. When the policeman attempted to arrest him, Raymond famously grabbed the officer's hand and twisted his finger until it broke. Obviously, this story became quite famous in the underworld of Montreal, and for a time, the Dubois brothers were seemingly untouchable, and they operated in the city with impunity. However, this would start to change around the mid-1970s. In 1975, the Montreal police organized a task force to specifically deal with the Dubois gang, and this involved major undercover operations. Montreal police would arrest many Dubois associates, and they got many of them to turn informant. The police would state that it was fairly unprecedented for so many associates of a criminal organization to break the code of silence and turn against their former gang. One of their many informants was Donald Lavoie, who was one of the brothers' most trusted hitmen, and Lavoie's testimony in court would be a huge hit to the Dubois organization. Another prominent gangster turned informant was Pierre McSween, who had been involved in serious conflict with the brothers. In the midst of all this, the Dubois brothers would frequently talk to the media, and it almost seemed like they enjoyed the attention, unlike the mafia who tended to shun publicity. In June of 1977, Claude Dubois would be interviewed by a reporter from the CBC, and he would publicly express contempt for Paolo Violi, even declaring him a punk. However, by this time, police had gathered so much information on the gang, largely due to high-profile informants, that they were able to start taking action. By the late 1970s, Roland and Normand had been arrested for assault. Claude and Adrian were in jail for giving false testimony to a police commission. Jean-Paul was convicted of possessing the proceeds of theft, and Jean-Guy Dubois was convicted of the second-degree murder of Jean-Guy Fournier. And as the Dubois gang was crumbling, other major organizations were on the rise in Montreal. The Hells Angels had established themselves in Canada in 1977, and around the same time, the powerful Sicilian Rizzuto family was taking over the Montreal Mafia. And then finally, in November of 1982, Donald Lavoie's testimony in court sent Claude Dubois to prison for life for the 1973 shooting of Frank Catroni's brother-in-law Richard Desormier, and this was largely seen as the end of the Dubois criminal empire. By the mid-1980s, the brothers were either laying low or behind bars. The Rizzuto Mafia had taken over as the main crime family in Montreal, and the Dubois brothers would fade into memory as the gang landscape in Montreal evolved. At their peak from the late 1960s to the mid-1970s, they were serious rivals to the Mafia, and one of the most powerful and feared gangs in Montreal's history. Okay, now I'm going to move on to Montreal's Haitian street gangs. They have been a distinct part of Montreal's underworld for decades. They have produced some of the city's best-known gangsters, and they are very influential in street-level drug dealing. So, from 1957 to 1986, the sadistic Duvalier family ruled Haiti as dictators. They had a private family army, as well as terrorist death squads, and they did their very best to simultaneously neglect and oppress the people of Haiti. During this period, many Haitians fled to North America, and a large portion of them settled in the French-speaking province of Quebec. In many instances, these Haitians in Quebec faced significant discrimination and racism, as well as complications with the Canadian government, with many of them facing deportation. At times, this included hostility from other gangs. I mentioned in the Gangs of Montreal Part 1 video that prominent Canadian bikers Mom Boucher and Salvatore Cazzetta started their careers in a Montreal-based outlaw motorcycle club called the SS, and this club was largely known for attacking non-white immigrants in the Montreal area. The Haitian Quebecois initiated numerous protests and political operations to fight for their rights. And I know it can seem like a cop-out to blame gangs on racism, but it really seems that Haitian street gangs in Montreal largely formed from discrimination and oppression from certain elements in Quebec society. And historically, Haitians in Quebec really did face heightened opposition. Haitian street gangs in Montreal started as a method of protecting themselves, but of course they eventually evolved into criminal organizations. The first Haitian street gang in Montreal was Les Bélangers. This started with a group of friends who would play basketball and hang out at Parc Sainte Bernadette, but the local Haitians called this park Parc Bélanger. There's a famous story in Montreal's Haitian community where a Haitian teenager was playing video games in a cafe and he was aggressively pushed out of the establishment by a group of people. This teenager, named Joel, would enlist his friends around Parc Bélanger to get back at the owner of the cafe. One of these friends was a young Ducarme Joseph, who would go on to become a prominent gangster in the city. The group of young Haitians gathered weapons and then confronted the cafe owner about Joel's treatment by the angry mob. Eventually, the owner of the cafe relented, and this is seen by many as the beginning of La Bélangère. The first leader of the gang was Maxime Aurélien, who co-wrote an interesting book with Ted Rutland titled Out to Defend Ourselves, A History of Montreal's First Haitian Street Gang. And this is an interesting book if you're really interested in the subject. The Bélangère boys didn't start out as a criminal organization, but many individuals would engage in petty crime, and they would develop connections with larger criminal organizations in Montreal, particularly the Hells Angels, who supplied them with drugs. The predominantly Haitian Bélangère would be involved in many conflicts with Jamaican street gangs in Montreal. There had been a long-standing tension between the Anglophone Jamaicans and the Francophone Haitians. The Bélangère boys fought with Jamaican gangs such as the Untouchables, the Uptown Posse, and the Downtown Posse, among many others. Many other young Haitians in Montreal were inspired by the Bélangère boys and started forming new gangs. In 1985, a new group called Master B was formed in Montreal North with the blessing of the Bélangère. Master B was founded by Bo-Gars, who would go on to publish his memoirs in 2011 in a book that was co-written with criminologist Pierre Tremblay. The most prominent former member of the Master B gang was a man named Gregory Woolley. Woolley became one of the most well-known gangsters in Montreal's history, and he was known in the city as the godfather of street gangs. Gregory Woolley was born in Haiti in 1972 and moved to Montreal with his family when he was young as part of the Haitian diaspora during the tyrannical Duvalier regime. The Woolley family was quite poor, and they lived in the neighborhood of Saint Michel, where Gregory became involved in street gangs and petty crime from a young age. He committed his first murder, a rival Haitian gang member, when he was only 17, and early on he was nicknamed Picasso because he was considered to be an artist at killing people. Greg Woolley would eventually join the Master B gang led by Bo-Gars. The Master B gang purchased their drugs from the Hells Angels, and Greg Woolley would develop a close relationship with Mom Boucher. Boucher saw great potential in Woolley, and he would eventually make him his bodyguard and protege. The Hells Angels are traditionally a whites-only group, but when Mom Boucher formed the Rockers Motorcycle Club in 1992 to act as an enforcement arm of the Hells Angels, he made Greg Woolley a member. Woolley would be instrumental in the infamous Quebec Biker War, which I covered in Part 1, where he would become one of the Hells Angels' top assassins. When Greg Woolley left Master B to join the Rockers Motorcycle Club, Master B essentially fell apart. After this happened, Master B founder Bo-Gars founded a new gang in Montreal North called the Bo-Gars. The Bo-Gars would develop strong ties to the Rizzuto mob and acted as street-level drug dealers for the Italian mafia. The Bo-Gars would start a propaganda campaign against Gregory Woolley, depicting him as an Uncle Tom figure, and claim that he was sucking up to the racist Hells Angels. Around the same time, Greg Woolley would start another gang called the Syndicate. There was another Haitian gang in the north end of Montreal called the Crackdown Posse, and Greg Woolley would arrange for them to act as a puppet club of the Syndicate. Over time, the Bo-Gars and the Crackdown Posse would become rivals. And then as the 90s progressed, the Bo-Gars rebranded themselves as the Bloods, while the Syndicate gang and the Crackdown Posse rebranded themselves as the Crips. And these new Montreal Bloods and Crips had no official connection with their American counterparts. As a side note, a similar thing happened in Toronto, with individual gangs calling themselves Bloods and Crips, without any real connection to the larger gangs in the US. This is a quote from Canadian crime writer Jerry Langton. Quote, "The LA Crips and Bloods were not asked or consulted. In all likelihood, they had no idea that there were Crips and Bloods in Montreal, if they even knew where Montreal was." End quote. Another Haitian gang would affiliate themselves with the Crips. In the late 1980s, notorious Haitian gangster Ducarme Joseph formed a gang called the 67s. The 67s had a strong rivalry with the Bo-Gars gang, who had affiliated themselves with the Bloods, and so by the mid-90s, the 67s, led by Ducarme Joseph, claimed allegiance to the Crips. And so ever since then, there have been multiple Montreal street gangs claiming to be Bloods and Crips, although they generally have little to no connection to the Bloods and Crips in the US, again, very similar to what happened in Toronto. But back to Greg Woolley. So at the same time that he was involved in creating and managing Haitian street gangs, he was also closely tied to the Hells Angels. He would eventually become the leader of the Rockers Motorcycle Club and one of their top hitmen during the infamous Quebec Biker War. Greg Woolley also developed close ties to the Rizzuto Mafia, particularly their Young Turk faction, people like Francesco Arcadi, Francesco Del Balso, and Lorenzo Giordano. Greg Woolley was a unique figure in Montreal's underworld. He was not only the head of an outlaw motorcycle club, but he was a key figure in connecting outlaw bikers, the Italian mafia, and various street gangs in Montreal. The infamous Quebec Biker War was the deadliest gang conflict in Canadian history, and it obviously led to significant police operations to bring down these gangs. After years of surveillance and gathering information, in no small part due to gangsters turned informants such as Danny Kane, police would launch Operation Springtime on March 30th of 2001. This culminated in a massive series of raids across the Montreal area, and all of the members of the Rockers would be arrested, including Greg Woolley. Well-known Montreal policeman Andre Bouchard claimed that Greg Woolley would be the first one to make a deal with him, but he was actually one of the only ones to keep his mouth shut, and he refused to cooperate with police. In 2005, Greg Woolley pled guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to traffic in narcotics, and gangsterism, and he would serve his sentence at Kingston Penitentiary. Even while he was in prison, police described Woolley as controlling the drug trade from his cell, even collecting a monthly income of $10,000. In 2008, the National Parole Board denied Woolley's parole request, and this is a quote from the board. Quote, "No matter where you find yourself in custody, the power conferred on you by your official status among bikers, and implicitly as the head of street gangs, is of such a scale that no program can sufficiently protect the public from the risk you present." End quote. On February 12th of 2009, hundreds of Montreal police and RCMP officers launched Operation Axe, which was one of the biggest sting operations in Montreal, and their goal was to take down street gangs associated with major organized criminal groups like the Hells Angels. 47 gangsters and associates were arrested across Quebec and Ontario, and this included Greg Woolley, who was arrested while serving his sentence at Kingston Pen. While he was in prison, Greg Woolley strengthened his ties to the Rizzuto Mafia, and he would spend time with Vito Rizzuto himself, who was also incarcerated, as well as Juan Ramon Fernandez, who was the Toronto agent of the Rizzutos. In 2011, Woolley was released on parole and returned to Montreal. During the civil war that tore apart the Rizzutos in the early 2010s, Greg Woolley would support Vito Rizzuto. Vito Rizzuto's support from Greg Woolley and the Hells Angels helped him survive the war between himself and the renegade faction led by Reynald Desjardins. During the 2010s, at least 12 members of the Desjardins faction would be killed in this conflict. In August of 2012, Greg Woolley arranged a meeting of different Black Canadian street gang leaders in Saint Adèle, where he called for a unification of all the Black street gangs under his leadership, which was fully supported by both the Hells Angels and the Rizzutos. The Rizzutos in particular wanted Black street gangs in Montreal unified under Woolley. Back in 2009, Nick Rizzuto Jr. was shot to death in Montreal, and it was later determined that Ducarme Joseph of the 67s gang was directly linked with the killing. Of course, there was a contract put out on his life, and the Montreal Mafia wanted order and control among the street gangs. During this meeting of Black Canadian gang leaders that Woolley arranged, a Haitian Canadian gang leader named Chenier Dupuis refused his offer, saying that it was a shame that Woolley was working for the racist Hells Angels, and slapped Woolley in the face. Chenier Dupuis and his deputy would be murdered a few days later. With these dissenters removed, this planned merger went ahead, and many Black street gangs in Montreal would be unified under Woolley's leadership. By this time, Greg Woolley was very close to the Rizzuto mob. Crime journalist Julian Cher is quoted as saying, "The Montreal Mafia leaders considered Woolley to be an equal to them." When Vito Rizzuto died in 2013, Greg Woolley was given a place of honor at the funeral, despite not being an official Mafia member, indicating that he was an important ally and powerful figure. Although Haitian street gangs were mostly allied with the Montreal Mafia, this certainly wasn't always the case. I mentioned how the leader of the 67s gang, Ducarme Joseph, was linked with the 2009 murder of Nick Rizzuto Jr. On August 1st of 2014, Joseph would be shot to death in the Saint Michel district of Montreal as retaliation for Rizzuto's murder. I mentioned that during the 2010s, the Rizzuto Mafia were in a significant conflict with a rogue faction led by Reynald Desjardins. Mom Boucher, who was in prison and loyal to the Rizzutos, ordered Greg Woolley to kill Reynald Desjardins. Of course, by this time, organized crime in Montreal was under constant surveillance and the target of multiple police operations. In November of 2015, 48 underworld leaders, including Greg Woolley, were arrested in a series of raids after police had found out that Woolley was planning to murder Desjardins. Woolley would avoid being convicted of this murder plot, but in October of 2018, he was convicted of conspiracy to traffic narcotics, and he would again be sent to prison. Woolley would be released from prison on parole in November of 2021, and he quickly became engaged to Christelle Huot, who was a reality TV star in Quebec and starred in the TV show Loft Story, and she was even known around the province as the Loft Exhibitionist for her frequent nudity and flamboyant behavior. The couple lived in a $3.8 million mansion in Montreal, which included a 400-bottle wine cellar, built-in sound system, in-ground pool, as well as guest accommodations. And although Woolley had many powerful allies, he had made many enemies during his lengthy career as a gangster. In 2022, someone drove by and shot at his house, and shortly after this, someone burned down his garage. Finally, on November 17th of 2023, Greg Woolley would be shot dead at age 51. He was killed in front of his fiancée and child, which was a major violation of the underworld code. Obviously, his funeral was a big deal in Montreal, and it was attended by various members of street gangs, the Hells Angels, and the Montreal Mafia. Greg Woolley was a major figure in the city. He was instrumental in connecting major organized crime groups, and he would go down as one of the most infamous and well-known gangsters in Montreal history. There are still many Haitian street gangs active across Montreal, including the 67s, the Syndicate, and the Crackdown Posse. And as I mentioned, there are also multiple Jamaican street gangs in Montreal, such as the Downtown Posse and the Uptown Posse, although in general, Jamaican street gangs are much more prominent in Toronto than they are in Montreal. And as I mentioned, many of these black street gangs in Montreal have affiliated themselves with the Bloods and Crips, although there is no official connection to the Bloods and Crips in the US. There are many other street gangs in Montreal, too many to list in this video, and of course they vary dramatically in size and influence. Zone 43 is a street gang that originated in North Montreal, and they've become quite influential in recent years. They've even expanded to Vancouver's downtown east side, and they've allied with the Wolfpack Alliance to traffic drugs in that area. Zone 43 was also involved in a violent conflict in Montreal with another gang called the Profit Boys, and throughout the 2020s, these two gangs would be involved in many violent altercations. Another fairly recent street gang in Montreal is FSO, which stands for Fly Shit Only. Honestly, some of these names. FSO has been involved in Canada-wide human trafficking operations, and they are known to violently brand their victims. Earlier this year, a member of FSO was arrested for trafficking women in Edmonton and Calgary. Many sources say that Montreal's gang landscape has been changing in recent years. In previous decades, groups like the Mafia, the Hells Angels, and the West End Gang had almost total control in the city. But in the midst of significant biker conflicts and the fall of the Rizzuto Mafia, street gangs are becoming much more powerful in Quebec. A good example of this is the Blood Family Mafia. They're actually based in Quebec City, and I'll cover them in more detail if I choose to do a Gangs of Quebec City video down the road. But the Blood Family Mafia gang is active across Quebec, including parts of Montreal, and in recent years they have been directly and openly challenging the Hells Angels' supremacy in the province, refusing to pay taxes and respect the authority of this larger group, and they've become very well known for their use of extreme violence. Direct attacks by the Blood Family Mafia on the Quebec City charter of the Hells Angels has badly damaged the reputation of the bikers in the Canadian underworld. The brazen actions of the Blood Family Mafia have seemingly emboldened other street gangs across Quebec, including in Montreal, to challenge the supremacy of the larger and older criminal organizations in the city. And of course, like most major cities, Montreal has had criminal organizations that represent a wide variety of different ethnicities. For example, there have been a number of smaller Hispanic, Cambodian, Sri Lankan, and Vietnamese gangs in Montreal. There are a couple street gangs of mostly North African descent in Montreal that have become a lot more prominent in recent years, and those are the STL gang, as well as Arab Power. Some sources say that the Arab Power gang is possibly linked with the death of that 14-year-old Algerian boy near Frampton last year. Another prominent crime family that's been active in Montreal is the Al Khalil family. I talked about them in the Gangs of Vancouver videos. The Al Khalils are a Palestinian family that came to Canada in 1990. They would settle in BC and they were most active in that province. However, Robbie Al Khalil in particular would develop strong ties to Montreal. He would open a high-end clothing store in the city, and he shared a luxury condo in Montreal with fellow gangster Larry Amaro. Robbie Al Khalil, along with Larry Amaro, were leaders of the Wolfpack Alliance, and they developed a significant drug trafficking operation across Canada. Shane Maloney of the West End Gang, who I talked about in the Part 2 video, was also a prominent member of the Wolfpack Alliance and provided access to the Port of Montreal. The Wolfpack Alliance operation in Montreal worked as distributors of cocaine for the Sinaloa cartel. Eventually, in August of 2020, Robbie Al Khalil would be convicted in Montreal of drug trafficking and sentenced to 8 years in prison. In 2021, Robbie would be sent to Vancouver to face further charges, and while he was in BC, he would escape custody. Robbie Al Khalil is currently at large. The RCMP declared him the most wanted man in the country, and there is a $250,000 reward for information on his whereabouts. And so the Al Khalil family and the Greater Wolfpack Alliance is yet another criminal organization that has been active in Montreal. There's also been a degree of Lebanese organized crime that has been active in the city, and they've mainly been involved in drug trafficking and money laundering. In April of 2017, 11 people affiliated with the Lebanese drug clan were arrested in Montreal and Laval as part of a 10-month police investigation called Project Affliction. During this operation, 32 kilograms of cocaine and 42 firearms were seized. The clan would transport drugs into Montreal by plane and supplied a large amount of drugs to the Hells Angels and Italian Mafia. And then very recently, Montreal's Muslim and Maghrebi communities have been expressing concern about their kids being recruited into street gangs. Late last year, there was a major story in Quebec where a 14-year-old Algerian boy was found dead near a Hells Angels-linked bunker near Frampton, and it's thought that this boy was involved in street gangs from the St. Leonard area of Montreal. And so overall, when you're looking at Montreal, there has been a very rich and complicated underworld history that stretches back many decades, and there are still significant conflicts that are happening today. And that's pretty much going to wrap this one up. Again, this was a very general overview of a very complicated topic, but in this series of videos, I did my best to put together a reasonable summary of some of the major criminal organizations that have been active in Montreal. I hope you found this one interesting and informative, and if you haven't already, then please consider subscribing to my channel. I post Canadian content in a wide variety of topics. And if you want to support my channel further, you can buy me a coffee, and there's a link to that below. Thank you for watching, I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Strange North channel.